Okay, hello everybody. It is Independence Day, sort of, July 4th, 2013. This is Joseph P. Farrell with news and views from the Nefarium. And a lot to talk about, some announcements. As some of you know on Facebook, I finished last night, or rather this morning, the new book. I still have to go through edits and so on. And some of you have been asking about the members' vid chat. I've been reluctant to post a notice about doing a makeup vid chat tomorrow. I'm trying to nurse this computer, I think it's on its last legs, through the process of finishing this book. But stay tuned. I may call one at the last minute on Friday. I still haven't made up my mind. Bear with me on the computer problems, folks. The other announcement, Georgianne is doing all right. I think she's going back to her doctor. Please keep her in your prayers. And as for the book, I think that's going to probably be out, from the looks of it, sometime in September. Financial Vipers, I haven't heard anything about. But it being Independence Day, I thought I'd talk about an interesting article that appeared in the UK's newspaper, the Daily Telegraph, by Sir Ambrose Evans Pritchard. And the article is entitled "France's Triumphant Joan of Arc Vows to Bring Back the Franc and Destroy the Euro." Now, we've talked a lot here about Germany, its calls to repatriate its gold. We've talked a lot about Italy, Greece, and Spain, and the growing discontent with the Eurocrats in Brussels. And now it has spread to France. And the reason I want to talk about France today, of course, was that France was the ally of the American colonies in their war for independence. And in fact, had it not been for the Vicomte de Grasse, Admiral de Grasse, in the Revolutionary War, the American victory at Yorktown would not have been possible, because it was Admiral de Grasse that drove away the British fleet under Admiral Hood, and thus was able to complete a blockade of the British forces that were trapped at Yorktown and bring about the British surrender of Lord Cornwallis. So let's talk about France. And I want to talk in particular about the French party called the Front National. This is being led by Marine Le Pen. All right. Now, for many of you who've been following French politics for a number of years, the National Front in France is a kind of fascist. I wouldn't say kind of. It is a fascist party. It's a party of the right, and the French politicians thus far have been allowing it to run more or less unimpeded, because what it does is it breaks up the vote on the right in France. But what is happening now is the National Front is gaining strength among the left. And it's all because the leader of the party, Mrs. Le Pen, is in fact in favor of getting out of the Eurozone altogether. And I want to read you 4 paragraphs that Ambrose Evans Pritchard wrote in this article, and then I want to pass on to a brief discussion that Catherine Austin Fitz and Dr. de Hart and I had this past weekend concerning all of the surveillance that's been going on, and kind of update you on a conversation that we had. But in any case, this is what's going on in the Front National in France. Mrs. Le Pen said that her first order of business on setting foot in the Élysée Palace will be to announce a referendum on EU membership. Rendezvous 1 year later. Quote, "I will negotiate over the points on which there can be no compromise. If the result is inadequate, I will call for withdrawal," unquote. And continuing with Ambrose Evans Pritchard, "The 4 sticking points are the currency, border control, the primacy of French law." Fancy that the French would want French law to apply in France. But, and what she calls economic patriotism, the power for France to pursue intelligent protectionism and safeguard it as a social model. Quote, "I cannot imagine running economic policy without full control over our own money," she said. Asked if she intends to pull France out of the euro immediately, she said, quote, "Yes, because the euro blocks all economic decisions. France is not a country that can accept tutelage from Brussels," unquote, she said. Officials will be told to draw up plans for the restoration of the franc. Eurozone leaders will face a stark choice: either work with France for a sortie concertée or a coordinated EMU breakup, or await their fate. Mrs. Le Pen fears that other EMU states will resist and let financial Armageddon run its course, but it is a risk that has to be taken. In other words, France is now joining the growing chorus, and we kind of predicted that this move would eventually come, although, of course, we have to wait the French national elections. Now, I want to make a little prediction of what might happen should Mrs. Le Pen actually win the French presidency. I suspect, and even if she doesn't, I still suspect, that the pressures on France for an increasingly independent, sort of autonomous condition from the EU will nonetheless remain even if she loses this election. And I suspect in turn that means that there is going to be tremendous pressure on France to go back to the franc as its national currency and withdraw from the euro. In other words, a kind of return to the pre-euro state, the common market state, where each nation still maintained their own currency. If that happens, expect the calls to get very vocal in Italy, in Greece, in Spain, and so on, for a pullout from the EU. But there's a second thing I'm going to suggest that's going to come out of this. I suspect you're going to find, increasingly, calls in France to repatriate their gold reserves. Now, if that happens, folks, if France and Germany both do this, then I think the jig is up for the EU. These are the two most important economies in the Eurozone, and of course these are the two most powerful nations in the Eurozone. So we can't really expect anything to come out of this, even if she does lose, other than a growing pressure on the Eurozone itself. They're going to either have to renegotiate the whole thing, as she indicates, or it's going to crack up. Now, I want to pass to a brief kind of discussion of the conversation that Secretary Catherine Austin Fitts and Dr. de Hart and I had during her visit this last weekend. We talked for about 10 hours altogether. I did do a recording for her on her Solari Report show, so those of you who are members of her website, you can look forward to that coming up. But now, the interesting thing that we talked about were all of the scandals concerning surveillance, and most recent scandal, I'll hold this one up. This is a report from the Huffington Post. Pedophilia priest exposes satanic Vatican rent boy sex ring. And I think this is kind of a smokescreen, folks, for what may be going on. It's another sex ring scandal, and we're kind of used to those right now in the Vatican. But we were talking in terms of the Vatican being the remnant, so to speak, of the medieval era's national security agency. Stop and think about it. Because it operates parishes at a local level virtually all over the world, and at that time, of course, all over Europe, it had an enormous capability to gather on the ground, grassroots level, human intelligence about what was going on. All right, and this all was funneled back to the central analytical center at Rome itself. So in other words, looking at it that way, you have a huge intelligence agency. And my former students will recognize my old statement that the oldest political chancery in operation, in continuous operation in the world, with the most experience, is precisely the Vatican. All right? Now, what's going on now, the way Secretary Fitts put it, was you have a clash of two very different business models between the NSA and the Vatican. And this is really very perceptive, because I think the sex scandals are, in a way, the indicator of the same modus operandi that's been going on, connecting some dots now between the two scandals, for a long time. If you stop and consider what the NSA has been doing, it's basically been gathering the ultimate, as Secretary Fitz put it, the ultimate in the insider trading mechanism, number one. And number two, it's been gathering a huge database of blackmail possibilities, all right, including all the way up perhaps even to the president himself. Just remember all of the scandals about where was he born and so on and so forth. These things, if they exist in an intelligence database, become the leverage that you would have over very powerful people. This would account in part for the non-responsiveness of the government to the people and the growing frustration that people have. Well, let's go to the Vatican now. The sex scandals are perhaps the result of the breakdown of a similar type of mechanism. And if you look at the competing business models now, and this again is Secretary Fitz's observation, you have two intelligence gathering organizations that function on a global basis. The one relies on technology, so in a sense it has a lower overhead because it's not operating all the expensive storefronts, as she liked to call them, which means the local parish church. And the Vatican, on the other hand, has a very different business model, human intelligence gathering, which means expensive storefronts. They're becoming increasingly more and more difficult to maintain. So she played out a scenario in which there could be behind-the-scenes fighting between these two very powerful intelligence gathering organizations. Now, I myself tend to think that the reality is probably very different. I tend to think that you're looking at two halves of the same power nexus. You need and will always need on-the-ground human intelligence, and you need and will probably always need an electronic intelligence gathering capability if you're a global elite, if you're a global oligarchy, all right? Now, we played out some other very interesting scenarios, and I'm not going to go into them too much in this vid chat. I talk about them at the very end of this book that we just completed. Why is it necessary to maintain a global intelligence network of this scope and scale? And I'm going to leave you with a thought, just to ponder, just to think about. Because surely it cannot be the case that this is all necessary for the so-called war on terror to track a few people, radical Islamicists and so on and so forth, or right-wing militarists or left-wing militarists, what have you. It surely can't be all just for that. The size and scale indicates that there's something else going on. And in that respect, recall that recently, very recently, just this week, President Putin of Russia stated that the Russians would not be so willing to see Snowden seek asylum in Russia because it would upset, and these were more or less his words, his U.S. partners. Well, partners in what? In the war on terror? Certainly Russia has attempted to help us out in this respect, and vice versa. But I suspect something else is going on. I suspect the reason that you would need such a vast electronic eavesdropping, surveillance, intelligence gathering network, both human and technological, is that you're tracking something very, very different, something of far bigger scale, something of a truly global significance. So I'm going to leave it to you to kind of ponder that and see what it means. I do think that Secretary Fitz has a good point that there might be some sort of factional infighting, but that's my point. It is factional infighting in this post-war intelligence structure. I suspect, as a final bit of high-octane speculation, that with these stories about continuing sex scandals in the Vatican, I say what I have suspected before here, and that is that this whole thing is a global network the recent Pennsylvania scandals, the Franklin scandal back in the 1980s, and going much further back into history for those of you who are real aficionados, the Wineville chicken coop murders in Southern California, very, very early in the 20th century. I suspect all of these things are indeed related. Now, the question is why? And again, I think part of it goes to blackmailing the very wealthy and the very powerful into doing your bidding, whatever your bidding may be. It's a long-term agenda, in other words, is what I'm suggesting here. And I'm suggesting very definitely that at some point there is a rogue group within the Vatican that has been a part of this global effort. After all, where would you better want to position yourself in the absence of an NSA to be able to have access to an intelligence database that is being pulled on human intelligence basis from all over the world? So I think more and more is going to come out about this story. And again, I think it's going to be deeply tied to political agendas and intelligence gathering. But I have to say, it was a stimulating conversation, this whole idea of two competing business models, the Vatican being in a real crunch because its business model is now being overtaken by events and by technology. So she's hinting at, and I tend to agree with her, she's hinting that there is a religious sort of agenda or a metaphysical agenda behind what the NSA has been up to, and I suspect that there's some truth to that. Anyway, happy Independence, or as I put it in today's blog, happy Make-Believe Independence Day. God bless everybody, and we'll see you on the flip side.